Hello, my friend. Today I will tell you another long-forgotten legend. Close your eyes and let the magic transport you to Middle-earth. Our journey begins in the quiet wood of Roscoll, where wildflowers bend in the breeze and foxes sleep beneath roots knotted with moss, lived Radagast the Brown, one of the 5 wizards sent to Middle-earth long ago. He was not the tallest nor the wisest of them, and he much preferred speaking to birds than to kings. Yet even so, there was a kind of knowing in his eyes that beasts trusted and trees welcomed. One morning, as dew still clung to the ferns and a faint silver mist drifted over the forest floor, Radagast was stirring a pot of something steaming and foul-smelling. It hissed like a whisper and smoked like a chimney, but he muttered to it gently, as though it were a fussy old friend. Suddenly the tree stirred, not with wind, but with movement. The branches creaked and bent, and from the shadows stepped a tall and weathered figure, shaped like bark and crowned with leaves. It was Ferindi, one of the lost Endwives who had wandered far from the gardens of old. Radagast straightened at once, his eyes wide with surprise. "Lady of root and blossom," he exclaimed, brushing moss from his robes. "By the song of Yavanna, what brings you so far west?" Her voice was low, like wind through hollow logs. "A sickness spreads in the north," she said. "The rivers run black, the trees drink poison, and something forgotten stirs beneath the stone. A kingdom drowned, now rising." Radagast frowned, the name tugging at the edge of his memory. "You speak of Kaldor?" She nodded once. "A dwarven realm swallowed in the Second Age by flood and folly. The waters there have turned foul. Beasts crawl from their holes, twisted by shadow, and worst of all, a relic of ancient evil pulses beneath the rock." Radagast stood still. Even the birds in the trees had fallen silent. "But why come to me?" he asked softly. "You are a friend to all that grows," said Verinda, "and this darkness will not stay in the north. It seeks to spread, to seep into root and well. The land calls for you." The Antwife turned then, her bark skin cracking like dry wood, and walked back into the forest, vanishing between 2 ancient oaks, as though swallowed by the very earth. Radagast stood alone, his staff trembling faintly in his hand. By midday he had packed his satchel with dried herbs, a flask of honeyed water, and a scroll inked in forgotten dwarfish runes. He called to his great friend, the eagle Meneldor, son of the wind, and within the hour was soaring northward on silver-tipped wings, far above the lonely hills. But he did not fly all the way. No, for Radagast preferred the whisper of grass underfoot and the language of stones beside the trail. In the Vale of Anduin he dismounted and followed the river north toward the chill and mist of the Withered Heath. And as he journeyed, he came upon a wide wooden lodge nestled among green meadows with smoke curling from its chimney and carved bear totems guarding the door. Here lived Thrain, a Beorning of grim heart and great strength. His people could take the shape of bears in battle, and their land was one of proud solitude. Yet Radagast knocked on the door with his usual cheer. It was opened by a towering man with a heavy beard and weary eyes. "I need your strength," Radagast said at once. "There's a shadow rising in the north, and I fear it will not wait for spring to bloom." Thrain grunted. "Shadows rise every season, old one. What makes this one so dire?" To Radagast told him of Kaldor and the Black Rivers and the Antwife's warning. Thrain listened in silence, his great arms crossed. When Radagast had finished, the Beorning sighed, deep and low like thunder. "My father spoke of that place," he said at last. "A city lost beneath the mountains. Dwarves with greed deeper than their minds. They dug until they struck water, or something worse. He said it was cursed ground." "Then you believe me?" "I believe the earth remembers. And I believe," Thra added with a sideways glance, "you'll not last long alone in such a place." Radagast smiled. "That's why I came to find you." And so Thra took up his axe, kissed the carved bear totem by his door, and followed the wizard north. But they were not alone for long. In the golden woods beyond the valley, where the last leaves of autumn clung like fire to the branches, they met a third traveler. She was slender and hooded in moss-cold cloth, her hair woven with tiny silver bells. She knelt beside a brook, whispering to the water as though asking permission to pass. Radagast recognized her at once. "Lindariel of Lorien," he said, bowing low. "Your hands heal the wounded woods. Will you walk with us into danger?" She rose, her eyes like starlight through fog. "I have heard the same whispers as you, Radagast. Something ancient wakes beneath stone. I go to learn its name, and if I can, to unmake it." So it was that the three companions, Radagast the Brown, Thra the Beorning, and Lindariel the Elven healer, set out for the Withered Heath. They crossed bleak moor and frozen stream, sleeping beneath pines that creaked with the weight of snow. Each night the darkness pressed closer, and each morning the land seemed more wrong. Ferns wilted, birds vanished. Even the stars above seemed dimmer. At last they reached the edge of the Withered Heath, a land of blackened crags and gaping caves, where dragons once had their nesting grounds. The air stank of rot and ash, and the rivers they followed had turned to bitter sludge, staining the rocks like blood. Radagast knelt beside the water and dipped a trembling finger into the flow. His face went pale. "This was once a stream of mountain melt," he murmured. "Now it carries death." Thra unslung his axe. Lindariel drew a blade thin as moonlight. None spoke, for words were too small for what waited ahead. And far beneath their feet, in drowned tunnels where no sun had shone for an age, something pulsed, faint and evil, like the heartbeat of a sleeping dragon, dreaming of fire. The kingdom of Kaldor was waking. The withered heath stretched before them like a wound upon the earth, gray and lifeless, scattered with bones bleached by time and forgotten by the living. The sky was overcast, dull and heavy, the clouds hanging low, as if they too were reluctant to look upon the land below. Though once the breeding ground of dragons, the place had long since fallen into ruin. What remained were gorges split by fire, rocks sharp as razors, and the thin, bitter scent of ancient things that should have stayed buried. They made their camp within the lee of a shattered hill near the broken spine of some long-dead creature. Radagast conjured a small flame with a whispered word and fed it with dried moss and shavings from his pouch. Lindariel prepared a draw of warmth from winterroot and ash leaf and passed it round without a word. Even Thrain, whose manner was usually blunt and unmoved, seemed subdued as he sat sharpening his axe with the slow rhythm of one who expected its use before dawn. The wind howled that night, not from any weather-worn cause, but as if the mountains themselves were keening. When Radagast closed his eyes, he could feel the tremble of the world beneath them like a vast breathing. It was faint but steady, and it did not belong to earth or beast. At first light they pressed onward. The stream they had followed thinned into a muddy trickle, winding its way through cracked rock and into a narrow crevice. Here the companions were forced to descend on foot, clambering down steep ledges and through narrow passes until the air grew cooler and more stale. Radagast walked at the front, staff in hand, its carved head glowing faintly with pale green light. It was Lindariel who spotted the carvings first, runes chiseled into the stone walls of the ravine, half erased by time, but unmistakably dwarfish in form. She ran her fingers across them as they walked, her eyes narrowing as she read aloud in a voice low and musical. Kaldor, stronghold of the deep forged. Here lies the work of the 7 hammers, lost beneath wrath and wave. Tread not where stone sleeps, for the flood was mercy. They all stood in silence a moment, reading the grim warning in their own way. Thra grunted and shouldered his pack.
Dwarves do love their riddles.
I take it this is the door. Radagast frowned. More like a throat than a door, he murmured. The passage ahead sloped sharply downward and disappeared into darkness. He held his staff forward, and the glow brightened, casting eerie light on the stone. They descended into the deep. The tunnel twisted and narrowed, and soon they were forced to walk single file, their footsteps echoing off damp walls. The deeper they went, the more they could feel it, that presence. It crept beneath the skin like cold water, and the air grew thick, as though mourning the silence that followed them. Long-forgotten side passages branched off at odd angles, choked with rubble, or drowned beneath pools of stagnant water. A scent of decay clung to everything. At last, the tunnel widened into a great chamber, its roof held by cracked pillars carved to resemble Dwarven kings. Most had lost their faces to time or flood, but one remained whole, a stern, hooded figure with eyes of jet and a crown shaped like flame. At the far end of the hall stood a great gate of black stone, sealed by ancient craft. Its surface bore no keyhole, no latch, only a single rune that pulsed faintly with red light like an ember in the dark, and the drawing was glittering. Mariel approached it cautiously. "This is no work of Khazad alone," she whispered. "There is elvish enchantment here. Something to keep the gate shut or keep something in." Radagast nodded. "I feel it too. The spell is old, older than the Third Age. It was woven in fear." Thra stepped forward, fingers flexing around the haft of his axe. "So, what do we do? Break it open?" "No," said Radagast quickly. "We don't force such doors. Magic bound in fear rarely yields to strength. We must listen to it and answer it." He stepped closer, touching the rune gently. A flicker passed through the stone like ripples in a pond. Then, in a soft voice, he began to chant, not words of power, but words of memory, names of trees, of rivers, of the seasons turning. He spoke of the stars and the silence between them. He told the gate that the world had changed and that the time of keeping secrets had passed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the room flared white, and the gates sighed open with a sound like wind through dry reeds. Cold air spilled out from beyond, thick with the smell of long dead things. The companions exchanged glances, and together they stepped through. They entered a city buried in stone. The walls were high, the streets narrow, lined with empty houses and fallen towers. It was clear the place had once been grand, a jewel of dwarven pride. But now it stood ruined and dark, broken by tremors and drowned in silence. Water glistened on the floors, reflecting strange lights from deep cracks in the stone. Mold crept over statues, and in some places, roots from the world above had punched through, growing twisted and strange. "This isn't just ruin," Lindariel murmured. "It's rot. The very stone is turning sick." Radagast knelt beside a pool of water. He cupped some in his palm and let it fall back. "It carries more than decay. It carries will." Thra stepped forward, brow furrowed. "Something's watching us." And he was right. From the shadows at the edge of the square, two eyes blinked, small, green, and slitted. Then another, and another. Shapes moved along the walls, hunched and quick, claws scraping stone. Goblins. Thrain hissed, "Too many." Radagast stood tall, his staff blazing now like a torch. Back to the gate quickly. But before they could turn, the goblins sprang. They came in a rush of snarls and shrieks, some bearing rusted blades, others simply teeth and claws. Thra roared and met them with his axe, carving a path through the first wave. Lindariel danced beside him, her blade flashing like moonlight. Radagast raised both hands, and vines burst from cracks in the walls, seizing goblins mid-leap and hurling them aside. But there were more. From a shattered tower above, a horn sounded, harsh and cruel. And from beneath the city, a deeper sound rose in answer. A groaning, grinding noise, like stone shifting beneath the world. The ground trembled, and far below them, something began to wake. The goblins shrieked as they fell back, not in fear of sword or spell, but of something far worse. The groaning noise from below deepened, echoing through the stone-like thunder under the sea. The ancient halls of Kaldor seemed to breathe, and from cracks in the floor rose a wind that stank of rot and iron. Radagast looked up sharply, his staff held aloft, while Lindariel pressed her back to a crumbling wall, blade ready. Thra had planted his feet and was gripping his axe with both hands, though even he cast a weary glance beneath him. The goblins did not flee entirely, but they scattered to the edges of the square, watching the center of the room where the floor had begun to shift. Stone cracked and buckled. Something beneath was rising. Then, with a grinding lurch, a great slab of the floor heaved upwards, revealing a hollow beneath, black as pitch and twice as deep. Out of that darkness rose a shape, half stone, half flesh, encased in armor, corroded with age and fungus. It stood nearly twice the height of a man, and its face, if it had one, was hidden behind a helm that gleamed faintly with sickly light. In its right hand it bore a mace the size of a wagon wheel. In its left it held a chain that trailed back into the pit like a leash. Radagast's eyes narrowed. "That is no goblin," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It's a Thra, a warden left behind." The thing raised its head slowly, and from beneath its helm came a voice like stone, grinding on stone, speaking words in the black speech that none of them understood, but the meaning was clear enough. It had awoken to guard something, and it would not let them pass. Thra didn't wait for introductions. With a roar he charged, axe flashing in both hands. The Thra raised its mace, and when the weapons met, the sound was deafening. Sparks flew, and Thra was thrown back across the square, slamming into a broken column and sliding to the ground. Dazed, but breathing. Lindariel leapt forward to distract the creature, dancing between its heavy blows. She moved like a shadow, striking between the plates of its armor with her slender blade, but the wounds barely slowed it. Radagast raised his staff, whispering to the stone itself, and from the ground rose roots and vines summoned from deep below, twisting around the Threw's legs and arms. For a moment it struggled, but then with a roar it broke free, sending shards of root and rock flying in all directions. "We cannot defeat it here," Radagast shouted, backing toward the gate. "Not in its own tomb." "But we must," Lindariel called, parrying a blow that shattered the paving stones beside her.
If it follows us out, it will bring ruin.
At that moment, Thraw stirred. His axe lay beside him, cracked along the edge, and he rose slowly, blinking blood from his eyes. He looked at the Thraw, then at the pit from which it had come, and his jaw tightened. "Called it," he said hoarsely.
Get to the relic, Radagast hesitated, but Thraw only nodded.
"I was born in the shadow of mountains. If I must fall, let it be here." Before either the wizard or the elf could protest, Thraw charged again, this time not to fight, but to distract. He slammed into the Thraw, forcing it backward toward the pit. It raised its mace, roaring in fury, but Thraw ducked beneath the swing and drove his shoulder into the creature's chest. They stumbled together, and with a crash of steel and stone, both toppled into the darkness below. Lindariel cried out, but Radagast seized her arm. "We can't help him now. He bought us time." "We must use it." Together they turned and fled from the square, the goblins too stunned or frightened to follow. They moved deeper into Kaldor through winding corridors and collapsed chambers, always following the faint pulse of magic that Radagast could sense, like the beating of a poisoned heart. At last they came to a narrow stair carved in a spiral around a vast, hollow shaft. The air was warmer here, and foul, heavy with the scent of sulfur and decay. Far below, a red light flickered like a coal breathing in the dark. Radagast leaned over the edge and closed his eyes. The relic was near. The shard that had corrupted the stone spoiled the water and drawn the goblins to its call. It lay at the bottom of this shaft in what had once been Kaldor's deepest vault. They descended carefully, Lindariel pausing often to listen. The walls were lined with carvings, most worn beyond recognition, but some still showed scenes of pride and tragedy. One panel showed dwarves forging weapons beneath mountains. Another showed the sea pouring into their halls. The last showed something being hidden, a flame enclosed in a box of stone buried beneath rooms of warding. Radagast paused before it. They tried to contain it, not to destroy it. They feared it too greatly. Lindariel touched the carving lightly, and yet it called out all the same. When they reached the bottom, the chamber opened before them like a wound, circular, domed, lined with statues that had collapsed into rubble. In the center stood a pedestal of black marble, and upon it, resting in a cradle of bone, was the relic, but was small. That was the first surprise. Barely the size of a child's fist, shaped like a shard of crystal with cracks along its surface that pulsed with a dull red glow. But the moment they stepped into the chamber, it filled the air with its presence. Lindariel gasped and clutched her head. Radagast staggered, leaning on his staff. "It's alive," she whispered. "It feels wrong, like it's whispering without words," Radagast nodded. "A fragment of something once greater, a thing born of fire and pride. If this came from a Silmaril, if it was touched by Morgoth himself, then its shadow would be long indeed." They approached slowly. Every step felt heavier, as though the very air resisted them. Radagast raised a hand, murmuring spells of binding and protection, and Lindariel drew a pouch of silver thread cloth from her satchel. She reached out toward the relic, but as her fingers touched it, the chamber trembled. Pra split the floor. From the shadows beyond the statues, more goblins emerged, silent this time, eyes wide as if drawn not by orders, but by the relic itself. They did not charge, they knelt. Lindariel looked around, alarmed. They worship it. Radagast reached for her, voice tight. Take it quickly. She wrapped the shard in the silver cloth and lifted it free of the cradle. At once the red light dimmed and the sense of pressure lifted, but only slightly. The goblins hissed, drawing closer, their reverence replaced by fury. Radagast raised his staff and with a cry struck the pedestal. The floor cracked wider and a deep rumble rose from below. He turned to Lindariel. Now we run. And so they did. The moment Lindariel wrapped the shard in silver-threaded cloth, the chamber erupted into motion. Goblins hissed and snarled, leaping from the shadows where they had once bowed in silence. Radagast turned and swept his staff in an arc, calling forth a gust of wind so strong it knocked several of the creatures flat, sending shards of bone and dust into the air. Lindariel pressed the wrapped relic to her chest and sprinted toward the stairs, her light feet finding every stone without hesitation. Behind her, the goblins recovered and gave chase, scuttling like spiders across the cracked floor and up the walls. The stairwell shook as they climbed. Loose stones tumbled from above, and the distant roar of collapsing chambers echoed through the tunnels like a storm in a hollow tree. As they ascended, Radagast threw up barriers of root and vine behind them, forcing the goblins to slash and claw their way through the living walls. It bought them seconds, nothing more. When at last they reached the upper corridors, the air was filled with dust and the sound of distant screaming. Goblins, yes, but something else as well. The voice of the Thrur echoed faintly, still roaring from the pit where Thra had dragged it. It hadn't fallen to its death. It was fighting still. Radagast and Lindariel raced back the way they had come, retracing their steps through broken chambers and shadowed halls. The runes on the walls glowed faintly as they passed, stirred by the presence of the shard. At every turn, more goblins appeared, though these no longer seemed united in purpose. Some rushed at them with wild fury. Others fought amongst themselves, driven mad by the relic's call. It was clear now that the fragment of Morgoth's power had not only poisoned the stone in the water, but the very minds of those drawn to it. A narrow bridge lay ahead, spanning a chasm that had not been there when they had first entered. The stone beneath the city was fracturing, as if resisting their escape. Lindariel leapt across first, landing lightly on the far side. Radagast followed more carefully, balancing his staff and keeping the bundle tight beneath one arm. Halfway across the stone beneath his foot cracked. He pitched forward, falling hard against the edge, and for a moment dangled over the abyss. Lindariel reached him just in time. With a strong grip, she pulled him to safety, and they scrambled away as the bridge collapsed behind them, taking 3 goblins with it into the darkness below. They didn't stop again until they reached the gate, the same gate they had opened before. It still stood ajar, the rune above it now glowing a deep orange, as if burning from within. The ground around it had cracked, and the pillars of the great hall groaned with the weight of impending ruin. Lariel paused, her breath ragged, and looked back. "Bren," she said, her voice barely audible over the noise of the city falling behind them. Radagast lowered his staff. "If there's still time, I'll find him." "You must get the shard away from here. I'm not leaving you." "You must," he said, placing the wrapped bundle into her hands. "This relic is too dangerous to remain in any hands. Take it to the elves of Lorien. They will know how to guard it." Lindariel stared at him for a long moment, then gave a single nod and turned, sprinting out into the tunnel beyond. Radagast watched her go, then turned back toward the city, his face grim. The halls of Kaldor were collapsing. He ran through the crumbling passages, calling Thraw's name. Dust choked the air. Stone rained from the ceilings. He reached the square where they had fought the Thraw and found the ground still split by the pit, though now widened into a gaping chasm. Radagast crept to the edge and looked down. Far below he saw movement, shadows dancing in the flickering light of fire. The Thrain was still standing, barely, its armor cracked, its helm shattered on one side. And beside it, leaning against a slab of broken rock, stood Thrain, his arm limp, his body bloodied, but alive. Radagast shouted down to him, and Thrain looked up, his face breaking into a tired grin. He gestured weakly. "Still standing," he called. "Sort of." "How do I get you out?" Radagast called back. Thrain's smile faded. He pointed across the pit to a stairwell, half buried in rubble. "That way leads to the surface, a dwarf passage, old. If it still holds, we can both get out." Radagast didn't waste time. He ran along the edge of the chasm, dodging falling stone and leaping over cracks. The stairwell was narrow and twisted, but he squeezed through, calling to Thraw as he descended. The air was thick and hot, like a forge that had been left to burn too long. When he reached the bottom, the chamber shook violently, and he barely managed to reach Thraw before another tremor struck. Together, they limped toward the passage Thraw had mentioned. The Thraw watching them from a distance. It made no move to follow, its strength spent, its purpose lost. With the shard removed, as they passed into the dwarf-mad tunnel, Radagast paused and turned, lifting his staff one final time. He murmured a word of sealing, and stones surged from the walls, collapsing the tunnel behind them, burying the Thrain and the ruined city in darkness. Once more. The passage was long, winding through the mountain like a forgotten vein. The light from Radagast's staff illuminated old carvings and rusted tools, signs of the dwarves who had once walked these halls. Thrain leaned heavily on the wizard's shoulder, his steps slowing with every turn. They emerged at last into cold, clean air. Snow had begun to fall, soft and silent, covering the ground in white. They stood on a ledge overlooking the valley, the withered heath stretching beyond. Behind them, a distant rumble echoed from the mountainside, as Kaldor collapsed fully into itself. Radagast helped Thrain down into the snow and wrapped him in his cloak. The burning was pale, but he gave a soft chuckle, though he muttered, "Did we win?" Radagast looked to the horizon where Lindariel had vanished into the trees with the shard. For now, the wind on the mountain was bitter, and snow gathered quickly on Radagast's shoulders as he sat beside Thraw, whose wounds had slowed but not broken him. The Beorning's eyes were half-lidded, his strength sapped by blood loss and the long battle. Yet his hand still gripped the haft of his broken axe, as if to remind the world that he was not finished yet. Radagast tore strips of linen from his pack and bound the worst of the wounds, murmuring spells of healing that coaxed warmth back into the warrior's limbs. "Even so," Thraw shivered. "We need shelter," Radagast muttered, glancing at the sky. The snowfall was no mere dusting. It was the beginning of a mountain storm, the sort that turned roads to ice and breath to smoke. He stood and peered down the slope, where the white-capped trees of the forest clung to the hills below. Somewhere beyond lay the edge of the Withered Heath, and if fortune favored them, a path to safety. He helped Thra to his feet, and together they began the descent, the wizard guiding the wounded Beorning carefully over rocks slick with frost. They moved slowly, often stopping to rest, the wind tugging at their cloaks and the snow rising above their boots. Radagast kept his staff lit with a soft, steady glow, casting a circle of warmth around them, but even that was not enough to banish the cold entirely. By dusk they had reached the edge of the forest. Here the trees grew thick and close, the pines bending under the weight of snow, their branches huddled like old men against the storm. Radagast found a hollow beneath an ancient oak dry enough to start a fire, and built a shelter from fallen boughs. He settled Thrain beside the flames and brewed from herbs that gave warmth and dulled pain. As night fell, the storm thickened, howling through the forest like a chorus of wolves. Radagast sat watch, his staff across his knees, eyes scanning the woods for any sign of danger. He did not fear beasts, not in the way others did, but the darkness that had clung to Kaldor still lingered in his mind, and he knew it would not give up its prize so easily. Far to the west, beneath the sheltering boughs of a different forest, Lindariel moved swiftly and silently through the snow. She had traveled alone for a day and a night, guided only by the stars and the faint pulse of the relic wrapped in silver. It tugged at her senses like a thorn in her thoughts, whispering temptations in voices she could not understand. She ignored them. Her path took her through the hills above the Anduin, where the trees grew thinner and the sky stretched wide and gray. Twice she had heard strange cries on the wind, and once she had glimpsed movement in the shadows, goblins perhaps, or something worse. But they did not follow, not yet. On the second night, as she rested beneath a hawthorn tree, she was woken by the rustle of wings. She looked up to see a great eagle circling overhead, its feathers dark against the moonlight. With a cry, it descended, landing gracefully upon a boulder near her camp. Its eyes were sharp and knowing, and Lindariel rose and bowed. "Meneldor," she said softly, for she knew the name of the eagle from Radagast's tales. "You come with news." The eagle lowered its head as if in greeting. Then it spoke, its voice deep and clear. "Radagast lives. He sends word. He says the shard must not reach open sky. It must be taken to Lothlórien, and there kept in shadow." Lindariel nodded. "I go there now. The forest is still many leagues away." "I will guide you," said Meneldor. "But we must fly," she hesitated, clutching the pouch tighter. "Will it be safe?" "It will not be safe," said the eagle, "but it will be swift." So she climbed upon Meneldor's back, and the eagle soared into the sky, wings cutting through the wind like sails of gold. Below them the land passed quickly, rivers frozen beneath sheets of ice, forests blanketed in snow, and the crumbling traces of old roads swallowed by winter. Meanwhile, Radagast and Thra had begun moving again, following the forest's edge southward. The wizard supported the Beorning as best he could, but it was clear Thra's strength was fading. His wounds had been deep, and no amount of herbs or magic could restore what had been lost in that fight beneath the stone. On the third day, they reached a small hill where a stream once flowed, now frozen and black. Radagast paused and knelt beside it, touching the ice. Even here, so far from Kaldor, he could feel the shard's poison in the land. The corruption ran deeper than he'd feared. It would take more than one wizard and a handful of brave souls to cleanse it. As they rested beneath the hill, a shadow passed overhead. Radagast looked up in time to see Meneldor flying eastward, Lindariel clinging to his back. Relief washed over him, tempered by urgency. The relic was on the move, but that meant others would follow. The goblins had tasted its power, and they would not be the only ones. That night, Thrain stirred restlessly in his sleep. He muttered names Radagast didn't recognize, fragments of old battles and lost kin. The wizard stayed at his side, whispering calming spells and listening to the trees beyond their shelter. Something was drawing near. He could feel it. Not goblins this time, but something older, something that moved with purpose. Just before dawn, the visitor arrived. It was tall and cloaked, walking with a staff and a slow, steady gait. At first, Radagast feared it was a trick of the fog, but as the figure stepped into the light of the fire, he saw the truth. The man wore gray robes and bore a silver circlet in his hair. His beard was long and white, his eyes sharp beneath thick brows. Radagast stood at once. "Saruman," he said quietly. The white wizard nodded. "So the rumors are true. You've stirred the roots of the world, Radagast." Radagast frowned. "I did only what was needed. The shard could not be left where it was." Saruman stepped closer to the fire, his expression unreadable. "And now it is loose again. You know what such power attracts. I sent it to Lorien." "Even so," said Saruman, his voice as smooth as falling snow, "the world shifts. The eye of darkness turns where the light begins to move." Radagast's eyes narrowed. "I won't let you take it, Saruman." "I didn't come to take it," the other replied. "I came to warn you. If Morgoth's touch remains in that shard, it is more than just a relic. It is a doorway, and someone will try to open it." He turned then, his cloak stirring behind him like mist, and walked back into the trees, leaving Radagast staring into the fire, uncertain whether he had been visited by a friend or something far more dangerous. Morning brought no warmth, only a pale, watery light filtering through the frost-laced branches above. Thrain stirred beside the fire, groaning as he sat up, one hand pressed to his ribs. Radagast helped him drink from a flask of melted snow and herbs. Though the Beorning's eyes were dull with pain, there was no sign of Saruman's passing. No footprints, no broken branches, not even the faintest disturbance in the snow. Whether the visit had been real or some strange vision conjured by the relic's lingering presence, Radagast could not be certain. But the warning lingered in his mind, like the echo of a bell. They set off slowly that morning, walking in silence beneath the wintry trees. Radagast supported Thrain when the ground grew steep, and paused often to let him rest. The forest here seemed untouched by the shadow that had fallen on Kaldor, though the birds were fewer and the wind carried a tension he could not name. More than once he glanced behind them, sure they were being followed, but saw only snow and branches. 3 days passed in this way. They foraged when they could, caught water in thawed leaves and sheltered beneath rocks or in hollows when the wind turned cruel. Radagast's thoughts often drifted toward Lindariel and the shard. He hoped she had reached Lothlórien safely. The land of the Galadriel was protected, guarded not just by warriors and spells, but by a power deeper than words. If the relic was to be kept safe, it was there. Far to the east, the forest of Lothlórien shimmered like a dream between the rivers Celebrant and Anduin. Its trees stood tall and golden, even in the grip of winter, their leaves defiant against the cold. Beneath their boughs, Lindariel descended from Meneldor's back and staggered to her feet, her face drawn from exhaustion. Elves in silver and green met her at the forest's edge, bows in hand, eyes wary. She held out the wrapped relic, her voice. "I bring a thing that must not be unwrapped." They led her in silence through winding paths and across wooden bridges deep into the heart of the forest where the light was soft and the air hummed with enchantment. There, in a high talon, woven between the trunks of mighty Maloran trees, stood a woman of radiant beauty and terrible stillness. Her hair was long and golden, her eyes ageless. Galadriel. Lindariel knelt before her and offered the bundle. The Lady of Lorien took it carefully, holding it as if it were a burning coal. She said nothing for a long while, and when she finally spoke, her voice was like wind through silver leaves. "So it has come to us at last, a shard of the past, broken but not powerless." She turned to a tall elf standing at her side, Celeborn, her lord, and together they carried the relic to a chamber of stone deep beneath the trees. There it would be sealed, not with locks of iron, but with song and silence, guarded by enchantments woven in the tongue of the Valar. But not all who served the light agreed. That night, as Lindariel rested in a chamber high among the trees, a meeting was held in the shadows of Caris Galadon. Some whispered that the relic should be destroyed, that even in fragments, the Silmarils were too dangerous to remain in the world. Others feared what might be drawn to it, or what power could be harnessed if it were claimed by those who served the darkness. Galadriel listened to each voice in turn, her gaze cool and unwavering, but gave no to the relic would remain for now. Back in the north, Radagast and Thrain at last reached the valley of the Unduin, where the river ran wide and slow between snowy banks. Smoke rose in the distance from the house of the Beornings, and Radagast quickened his pace. When they reached the threshold, the door opened before they could knock. A woman stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes like Thrain's and a scowl twice as fierce. "You're late," she said, and stepped aside. Inside, warmth and light welcomed them. Thrain collapsed onto a bench near the hearth, groaning as his sister fetched water and tore the cloak from his shoulders. She looked him over quickly, then rounded on Radagast. "What did you do to him, old man?" Radagast raised both hands. "Nothing he didn't offer freely. Your brother saved us all." Thrain coughed. "Tell her I fought a troll or two." "That sounds better than tripped into a pit with a mountain wearing armor." His sister rolled her eyes and fetched salve and clean bandages. Radagast stepped back, allowing her to work, and wandered to the window. Outside, the wind had calmed. For the first time in days, the sky was clear. He did not stay long. By the next morning, after a night of rest and a hot meal, Radagast set off once more, leaving behind the safety of the Beorning house. He had not forgotten Sauron's warning, nor the pulse he had felt in the stone beneath Kaldor. The shard had been removed, yes, but the darkness had been awakened. It was not long before word reached him of strange happenings in the east. Villages near the edge of the Brown lands had fallen silent. Streams, once sweet, had turned bitter. Travelers spoke of pale figures moving through the fog, and of whispers that carried no voice. Radagast journeyed swiftly across the river and into the plains beyond. Here the land was bleak and bare, marked by broken trees and old scars from wars long past. It was said no bird sang here, and indeed the sky was empty above him. Even the smallest creatures had gone quiet. In one such village he found nothing but ashes. The houses had been burned, the wells had turned black. There were no bodies, only the lingering scent of rot and the symbols etched into the stone. Crude, jagged runes smeared with something dark. He knelt and touched the ground, feeling for the traces of life, but found only emptiness. Then, as he stood to leave, he heard it. A voice, not a voice in the air, but in his mind, whispering from far away. It was faint, like the echo of a scream swallowed by stone, but it was unmistakable. The Shard. It was calling even from behind Galadriel's strongest wards. Radagast's heart sank. The relic had not been silenced. It had been provoked. Radagast stood alone in the ashen ruins, the last of the sunlight slanting through the blackened rafters of what had once been a barn. The whisper had faded, but the memory of it lingered like smoke in his thoughts. He wrapped his cloak tighter about himself and turned away from the village, heading east, his boots crunching softly through frost-covered grass. The relic's call was no accident. Even bound and sealed, it stirred something old, something that remembered the world as it had been under shadow. He traveled by night as well as day, speaking little to the creatures he passed. The wolves kept their distance, and even the crows, once bold in his presence, circled wearily above and did not call out. It was not fear of him that held their tongues, but fear of what followed him. The land itself seemed uneasy. Winds blew against the trees without sound, and the stars above appeared more distant than usual, flickering faintly in the vastness of the sky. Radagast did not sleep much, and when he did, his dreams were filled with dark tunnels and the sound of water dripping on stone. By the seventh night, he reached a hill overlooking a narrow canyon, its walls sheer and white with frost. A single tree grew at the summit, a gnarled elm bent sideways by years of wind. And there he paused, resting beneath its branches and gazing out at the land beyond. From here he could see the eaves of Lothlórien far in the distance, where the golden canopy met the blue-gray dusk. It was a beautiful sight, but even from this far he could sense it, the subtle throb of power like a drumbeat in the bones of the world. The Shard was awake. Lindariel, meanwhile, remained in Lorien, though her welcome had turned cautious. The elves treated her with courtesy and gave her lodging high in the trees, but there was tension in their voices and unease in their glances. Even the wind and the golden leaves seemed quieter when she passed, as if the very forest watched her. Galadriel had not spoken to her again since the relic was sealed, and Celeborn had said little when they crossed paths on the paths above the city. She spent her days walking the forest's edge, speaking to the trees in Elvish and listening for signs of change. And there were signs, though few others seemed to notice them. The birds sang less often, and the rivers, though still clear, flowed more quickly, as if fleeing some unseen presence. One night, while standing beneath a mallow tree, she felt the Shard shift. It was not a physical movement, but something stranger, a tug, like a thread being drawn tight. She ran to the chamber where it had been sealed, finding it unbroken, the guards still posted outside. But when she placed her hand upon the stone, she felt the vibration, low and steady. The next morning, Galadriel summoned her. In the high Talene, where silver lamps glowed with no flame, the Lady of Lorien stood beside the pool of her mirror, her face drawn and her hands clasped tightly. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she motioned for Lindariel to look into the water. The elf obeyed, leaning forward until the rippling surface cleared. She saw the relic first, lying wrapped in its silver cloth, though now the glow of the red shard beneath it was stronger, pulsing faintly through the weave. It's around it. Shadows stirred. Not goblins this time, but darker things, shapeless, wreathed in mist. And beyond them, half seen in the fog, stood a figure cloaked in black, unmoving and silent. Galadriel's voice broke the silence. It calls to those who remember Morgoth's name, and to others who are shaped by him. And Dario looked up. "Do you know what the figure is?" "No," said Galadriel. "But it is coming." For several days after, Lorien grew quieter. The borders were strengthened, watch increased, but the sense of waiting only grew heavier. Even the light beneath the mallow trees felt dimmer. Lindariel spent more time in the tower, keeping vigil near the sealed chamber, her hand never far from the hilt of her blade. She felt the relic's call sometimes, soft like a breeze against her thoughts, and it took all her will to ignore it. The cloth around it had begun to fray. Back in the east, Radagast crossed the fields of Parth Cabrant under the waning moon. He did not rest, for dreams had turned against him. Shapes followed him in silence now, not seen, but sensed, as though the trees he passed marked his passing and shared the news with others. On the third night, he lit no fire, fearing the light might draw more than warmth. That was when the rider came. It appeared just after midnight, hooves silent upon the frost. At first, Radagast thought it was a man wrapped in black and cloaked in silence. But when the figure dismounted and drew back its hood, the truth became clear. The rider's skin was pale gray, its eyes sunken deep into shadowed sockets. And when it opened its mouth, no words came, only a long, shuddering breath. Radagast lifted his staff, murmuring a word of power, and a ring of light burst outward, driving the creature back a step, but it did not flee. Instead, it reached into its cloak and drew forth something small. No weapon, but a shard of dark stone, glowing faintly with a red light that mirrored the relic in Lorien. Radagast's blood ran cold. "You found a second," he whispered, more to himself than the creature. "There's more than one." The thing did not answer, but slowly backed into the trees, vanishing between the trunks like mist before dawn. Radagast did not sleep after that. By the time he reached the outer glades of Lothlórien, the land was quiet and cold, as though holding its breath. The golden leaves of the mallow trees stirred without wind, and the elves who met him at the border carried drawn bows and hard expressions. He was brought swiftly through the forest to the high talon, where Galadriel awaited him, eyes shining with an intensity that pierced through weariness. "There's another shard," he said without waiting to be asked. "A creature carries it. I don't know how it came by it, but it's moving through the east." Galadriel did not seem surprised. The Silmarils were never truly lost. When Morgoth's crown was broken, the stones were scattered. One fell to the earth, another into fire, and the last into the sea. But shards may remain. Lindariel stood behind her, arms crossed tightly. "Then the one in our keeping is not the only danger." "No," said Radagast, "but it may be the loudest." The lady turned to face them both, and her voice was steady. "Then it is time we decided. Do we hide it forever, or destroy it and face what comes?" The chamber beneath Caras Galadon was colder than it had any right to be. Though sealed with ancient enchantments and hidden deep beneath the golden trees of Lothlórien, the room had grown dimmer, and a chill clung to its stone-like breath frozen mid-air. A single lamp flickered near the far wall, but its light refused to touch the center of the room where the relic lay, still wrapped in silver thread cloth, yet now glowing faintly through the weave with a rhythm like a heartbeat. Radagast stood at the threshold, his staff in hand, gazing at the bundle in silence. Beside him, Lindariel remained still, watching his face. She had not spoken since they entered, and he could feel her unease pressing against him like a second cloak. They both knew what they were about to do might not be wise, but the time for wisdom had passed. Galadriel entered a moment later, her steps light as breath. She said nothing, but the air shifted when she approached, and the glow from the relic dimmed slightly, as if even it recognized her presence. She turned to them with the calm authority of one who had seen the world change many times and bore the weight of such memories without fear. "It must be unwrapped," she said. "No more guessing. We must see it, understand it, or we will be struck blind when it moves again." Radagast didn't argue. He knelt slowly and reached out, fingers trembling slightly as he touched the cloth. The silver threads sparked faintly at his touch, but they did not resist. He unwrapped the bundle layer by layer, revealing the shard at last. It was jagged, no longer than the palm of a hand, and looked as if it had been broken from something far greater. Its surface was glass-like, with veins of crimson running through it like cracks in obsidian. As soon as it was exposed to the air, the room grew colder still, and a low hum filled the silence. A sound not heard with ears, but with bone. Then Dariel inhaled sharply, and Galadriel's eyes narrowed. "I know this light," the lady said, her voice distant. "It is not of this age. It bears the echo of the trees, long dead, long grieved, but twisted like sunlight filtered through poisoned glass." Radagast leaned closer. "There's a memory in it, not a thought, more like a hunger. It remembers being whole, and it wants that again." Galadriel turned toward him. "And so it calls to what remains. Others like it, broken pieces of a greater thing, shattered and scattered. They draw together as all lost things do." "Then we can't destroy it, can we?" Lindariel asked quietly, not without awakening the rest. Galadriel's expression was unreadable. "Perhaps not, but we can try. We can shape the attempt so that if we fail, the failure does not spread." Radagast wrapped the shard again and rose to his feet. "Then I'll take it. I've felt the mountain's fire before. Perhaps I can carry it there to the roots of Eroduin. If anything still has the strength to unmake this thing, it's the fire that once destroyed the ring." But Galadriel shook her head. "The road to Mordor is closed. Orcs gather again in the ruins of Baratur, and worse things stir beneath the ash. You would not survive that journey." "Then what would you have me do?" Radagast asked, more wearily than angrily. "Let it rest here until the next war begins." For a moment, no one answered. Then Celeborn stepped from the shadows where he had been standing silently for some time. His voice, as always, was calm and measured. "There is another way, a place deeper than fire, older than the mountains, the roots of the world, where the earth still remembers the first song." Galadriel nodded. "The silent deep." Lindariel turned sharply. "You don't mean the deep beneath Khazad-dûm? That place has been sealed since the Balrog's fall." "Nothing good lies there." "No," said Galadriel, "not Khazad-dûm. Deeper still. Beneath it lies a network of forgotten caverns beyond the reach of dwarves, beyond the knowledge of maps. They call it
Nonduhiran's shadow, a hollow of silence where even the valor do not tread. If the shard can be buried there, it may fall beyond the reach of all things. Radagast hesitated. "You ask me to go into the dark again." "No," Galadriel said. "We ask you to end it." He looked to Lindariel, who met his gaze steadily. "You won't go alone," she said. "Not this time." They left Lorien the next day. The forest was quiet as they departed, and the golden leaves stirred faintly in farewell. Meneldor waited for them on the edge of the trees, his wings folded and his sharp eyes watching the horizon. Radagast climbed onto his back with care, cradling the relic beneath his robes, and Lindariel followed. The great eagle took to the sky with a single powerful motion, and the world fell away beneath them. They flew west over the misty mountains, where the peaks rose like jagged teeth into the clouds. Below them, the world was gray and slumbering. Snow covered the upper ridges, and wind howled through the passes. But Meneldor flew steady and true, his wings barely stirring the air. By dusk, they reached the cliffs above the valley of Azanu Bizarre, where the Battle of the Dimmel Dale had once stained the snow with blood. The ruins of dwarf camps still dotted the ridges, though little now remained but broken stones and rusted shields. Here they landed and made camp beside a spring that ran clear and cold from the rock. As the fire crackled, Lindariel unwrapped a small map from her satchel. "There's an entrance," she said, pointing to a jagged mark near the southern face of the cliffs. "A fissure once used by dwarves to reach the deeper veins. Most believe it collapsed long ago." Radagast nodded. "Then that is where we begin." They reached the fissure by midday after climbing a narrow path slick with ice. The entrance was barely large enough for a man to squeeze through. Hidden behind a fall of stone and brambles, but beneath the loose rocks, a dark passage opened, descending steeply into the earth. Lindariel lit a lantern. Radagast raised his staff, and together they stepped into the dark. The walls closed around them almost at once, the stone pressing close, the air still and heavy. Water dripped in the distance, but the sound did not echo. Instead, it vanished into the silence, swallowed whole by the depth. After an hour of walking, the passage narrowed again, and they had to move sideways through a crack in the wall before it opened into a vast cavern lit faintly by glowing moss. They paused, staring. It was beautiful and strange, this place beneath the world. Stalactites hung like the teeth of forgotten beasts, and deep pools mirrored the light in shifting patterns. No wind stirred, yet the moss swayed gently, as if breathing. "This is the edge," Radagast whispered. "Beyond here lies the deep." They crossed the cavern slowly, their footsteps muffled by damp moss and stone. The silence around them was not the simple hush of a quiet forest, or the solemn stillness of ancient ruins. It was deeper, heavier, like a blanket pressed over the world, swallowing every sound the moment it was made. Even Radagast's staff, which had glowed so reliably in the deep places of Middle-earth, now gave off only a pale, reluctant light. Lindariel's lantern flickered often, though there was no wind to trouble its flame. The walls of the cavern soon narrowed into another tunnel, twisting like the coils of a serpent. It descended in steep spirals and sudden drops, at times forcing them to climb down by root or crag, and at others to crawl through spaces barely wider than their shoulders. The deeper they went, the more the stone changed. It lost the gray of mountain rock and took on a smoother, darker sheen, like obsidian polished by water and time. Here and there, faint veins of silver and crystal pulsed with a soft inner glow. not bright enough to guide by, but too strange to ignore. Radagast moved with growing caution. Every step forward seemed to weigh more than the last, and not only because the pack on his back grew heavy. The shard pulsed against his chest in slow, steady beats, not unlike a second heartbeat. He could feel it thinking, or perhaps remembering, though it had no voice and gave no words. Lindariel kept pace beside him, her hand never far from her sword, though she had not drawn it yet. Even in this place, steel seemed too loud a promise. They reached a ledge overlooking a vast hollow where the ceiling rose out of sight and the ground dropped away in a slow, curving descent. Pale light came from below, not from fire or sun, but from some source hidden in the roots of the world. Great columns of stone rose from floor to ceiling, each carved with symbols that none of them could read. Strange spiraling marks that reminded Radagast of runes, but older, more primal. "This is it," he said softly. "The silent deep." Lindariel stepped forward, brushing a hand across one of the carvings. Her fingers came away cold, and she shivered. "I feel as though we've stepped outside the world," she murmured, "like this place isn't part of Middle-earth at all." "Perhaps it isn't," Radagast replied, lowering his pack. "Or perhaps it's the part we forgot." They descended the slope carefully, weaving between the pillars, always moving toward the source of the light. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became, until even the sound of their own breath seemed distant, like it belonged to someone else. It was then, just as they reached the heart of the hollow, that Radagast stopped. The ground here was smooth, carved into a shallow bowl. At its center was a disk of white stone, unmarked and untouched by time. Nothing grew here, and yet the air was filled with a strange scent. Neither decay nor bloom, but something older still. Radagast knelt beside the disk and carefully unwrapped the shard, placing it at the center. The moment it touched the stone, the cavern trembled. It was not a violent shaking, but a low vibration that spread outward, as though the stone itself had drawn breath for the first time in an age. The shard pulsed brighter, casting red shadows across the dais. Lindariel stepped back, her hand now firmly on her sword, and watched as faint whispers began to stir, not in the air, but in their minds. They came like old memories barely formed, cries of battle in ancient tongues, the clash of sword on shield, a woman weeping beside a silver tree, a fire that never died. Radagast closed his eyes and tried to steady his thoughts, but the shard was speaking now, not in words but in images, fragments of its long, broken existence. Then from the darkness beyond the columns came a sound. It was faint at first, like a footstep on stone. Then another, then many. Lindariel turned sharply, eyes scanning the shadows. Shapes moved between the pillars, tall and lean, wrapped in dark cloaks. Their eyes glowed faintly, pale and distant. They were not goblins nor wraiths, but something older, something carved from shadow and memory. Radagast stood and stepped protectively in front of the dais. "It called to them," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "It summoned what remains of Morgoth's will." The figures approached slowly, circling the dais without drawing weapons. They moved with grace, their limbs long and smooth, their faces hidden beneath veils of black. One stepped forward, its hands bare, its palms marked with the same spiraling runes as the columns. "You are not of this world," Radagast said. The figure tilted its head. When it spoke, its voice was neither male nor female, but something in between, soft and cold. We were born of the breakage. When the Silmarils were torn from the sky, we awoke, shards of light twisted by sorrow. You bring us our kin. Radagast shook his head. This shard must be buried, forgotten. It cannot remain. Light cannot be buried, said the figure, only changed. Another stepped forward, and Radagast could feel the shard pulsing more rapidly now. It was responding not to them, but to itself, as though it longed to be whole again. Lindariel unsheathed her blade, its elven edge gleaming in the dim glow. "We won't let you take it." "You have no choice," came the reply, and the circle closed tighter. Radagast raised his staff and struck it against the dais. A burst of energy rippled outward, casting the shadowed figures back for a moment. He turned to Lindariel. "We must end it now." She nodded and stepped beside him, blade ready. "I need time," Radagast said. "Guard me." She didn't answer, only stepped forward to meet the first of the shadow creatures, her sword flashing as it clashed against the air, not striking flesh, but pushing back whatever force tried to draw close. Radagast placed both hands on the shard and closed his eyes. He reached deep, not just into himself, but into the earth, into the oldest roots of Middle-earth, where memory still lived and the first song still echoed. He called upon the name of Yavanna, upon the breath of Aule, upon the silence before the shaping of stone. Bashard resisted. It surged with heat and light, screaming without sound, trying to break free. Images flooded his mind. Flames consuming a fortress, a dark hand reaching for a crown, a mountain splitting in grief. But Radagast held firm. "By the earth that bore you, by the fire that broke you, I name you ended," he whispered, and drove the shard into the heart of the dais. There was a flash of light, pure and blinding, followed by a silence so deep it drowned everything. The ground shook, the columns cracked, and the figures screamed as they vanished into mist. When the light faded, the shard was gone. Radagast collapsed to his knees, breathing hard. The dais was cracked through the center, the stone scorched black. Lindariel knelt beside him, bruised and bloodied, but alive. "It's over," he said, though he sounded unsure. She looked around at the dark, silent chamber and nodded slowly. For now, they did not speak for some time. The silence that followed the destruction of the shard was different now. No longer heavy or oppressive, but vast and empty, like a breath held in the wake of something enormous. The chamber had darkened, though not entirely. The veins of silver and crystal embedded in the walls still glowed faintly, and the air had grown warmer, as if the deep itself had relaxed. Radagast remained on his knees beside the shattered dais, his hands still pressed to the blackened stone. The strain had taken its toll. He looked older, his shoulders slumped, and his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. Lindariel sat beside him, her sword resting across her lap, the blade now dulled and notched from the clash with the shadowed figures. Her eyes remained on the edge of the light, watchful, though nothing stirred. Whatever those beings had been, echoes, guardians, remnants of a darker will, they had vanished entirely with the shard's end. There was no sign of their return, no trace of their passage, not even footprints on the moss-covered floor. Eventually, Radagast stirred. He rubbed his eyes and pushed himself upright with a groan. "We must go," he said hoarsely. "I don't know how long this stillness will last, and I would rather not wait to find out." Lindariel helped him to his feet, and together they began the long ascent, retracing their steps through the spiraling tunnels and narrow passages of the deep. The journey upward was slower than the descent. Every stone felt heavier now, every ledge steeper. They paused often to rest and drink from their flasks, speaking little. The light from Radagast's staff had dimmed to a soft glow, barely enough to light the path ahead, but neither of them complained. It was not until the second day of climbing that they began to hear the sounds of the world above once more. First, the faint drip of water, then the distant rumble of wind, and finally the far-off cry of a bird echoing down the shaft of the fissure. They followed the sounds with renewed urgency and emerged at last into daylight, blinking beneath a sky strit with soft clouds and lit by the golden light of a late afternoon sun. Snow still clung to the cliffs, but the storm had passed and the wind was gentle. They camped just beyond the fish's mouth that night, too exhausted to press on, and built a small fire from the fallen branches of wind-blasted trees. Radagast sat close to the flames, warming his hands, while Lindariel unpacked what remained of their supplies. It was not much. Dried fruit, a few strips of tough venison, and water, but they ate in silence, grateful to be above ground. Later, as the stars emerged overhead and the fire settled into soft embers, Radagast stared into the flames and spoke. "I had hoped that destroying the shard would feel clearer, as if something great had been lifted from the world. But instead, it feels like we've only just stepped through a door." Lindariel didn't answer immediately. She sat cross-legged on the other side of the fire, her cloak wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes thoughtful. "We ended something," she said at last. "But perhaps something else has begun. If that shard could call to things beyond memory, how many more are out there, still waiting to be found?" Radagast sighed and nodded slowly. "More than I care to imagine. But if the others are anything like this one, they'll resist being unearthed. The world itself may bury them deeper." "Maybe we did more than stop something, Lindariel. Maybe we reminded the earth to sleep." The next morning, Meneldor found them. The eagle descended from the sky with a rush of wind and snow, landing gracefully on a high rock above their camp. He had been watching from afar, and now that the relic's power had faded, he had returned to guide them home. Radagast smiled at the sight of his old friend and reached up a hand in greeting. Lindariel packed their things quickly, and within the hour, the three of them were airborne once more, flying eastward across the wide spine of the mountains. The flight to Lothlórien took most of the day. They passed over ruined fortresses and frozen lakes, over paths once walked by armies long dead. From the air, Middle looked peaceful, its valleys silver with frost, its rivers dark and slow. But Radagast knew better. The relic had sent a signal, even in its ending. Those who knew what to listen for would have heard it, and those who had forgotten would soon begin to remember. They reached the forest by nightfall. The trees of Lorien still shimmered with golden light, though winter had crept among them. Elves met them at the border once again, though this time their welcome was warmer. Galadriel stood in the high talon as they climbed the steps, and when they reached the top, she greeted them not with words, but with a soft nod and a glance that seemed to see everything they had endured. "The shard is no more," Radagast said quietly. "The deep took it back." Galadriel placed a hand on his shoulder and guided them to sit. "Then the work is begun." They spoke late into the night, not only of the shard, but of the visions it had shared, the places it had shown, the voices that had come with it. Galadriel listened carefully, asking few questions, her mind turning over truths too ancient for most to comprehend. When at last she spoke, her words were measured. There are still those in the world who remember the Silmarils not as relics, but as promises. Lighthorn of creation cannot be unmade, only transformed. You have shattered one vessel, but the light has fled. It may yet return in some new form. Radagast looked weary, but not defeated. Then we'll face that when it comes. For now, we've done what we can. Celeborn brought them food and drink, and for the first time in many days, they rested in comfort, high among the trees, with soft lamps glowing around them, and the sound of leaves whispering in the night. Lindariel stood on the edge of the Talon, gazing out over the forest. She had changed, more than she realized. The darkness had touched her, yes, but it had not claimed her, and in its place had grown a resolve stronger than steep. That night she dreamed of a silver tree standing alone in a field of stars. In the days that followed, peace returned to Lothlórien, at least on the surface. The golden leaves still whispered overhead, the streams still sang as they passed between tree roots, and the stars above the mallard trees glittered like distant jewels in the clear night sky. But beneath the beauty, something had changed. The elves moved with a greater sense of purpose, and the guards along the borders were doubled. Galadriel spoke often in private with Celeborn, and though her voice never rose, the weight of her gaze carried deeper concern than words could express. Radagast spent most of his time in the healing gardens, tending to the root beds and speaking to the birds that perched on the highest branches. He was quieter now, more thoughtful, and often paused in the middle of his tasks, as though listening to something far away. Lindariel, too, walked the forest paths alone, more often than before. She found herself drawn to the borders, watching the world beyond with new eyes. A relic's destruction had left its mark on both of them, not as a wound, but as a line drawn deep, something remembered by the spirit, even if the mind tried to forget. One evening, as the moon rose over the eastern edge of the forest, Radagast was summoned to Galadriel's Talon once more. The lady stood beside the silver basin of her mirror, her face half-lit by the glow of starlight, and said nothing until the wizard had joined her. Then she raised one hand and let the water settle. In its reflection, he saw distant places, a snow-covered valley where no fire burned, a black fortress crumbling beneath a red sky, a ship drifting through sea mist with no sail or crew. And then, flickering at the edges, came the images that stirred him most. A splinter of stone glowing faintly, a tower rising where none had stood before, and eyes always watching, waiting just beyond the veil. "The shard is gone," Radagast said, more to himself than to her. "But the echo lingers," Galadriel nodded slowly. "Light once released does not vanish. It changes, spreads. There are others who will seek it, not out of loyalty to Morgoth, but out of hunger, or fear, or hope?" Radagast frowned. What would they hope to find? Power? Immortality? "Meaning," she replied, her voice soft and steady. "The Silmarils were more than jewels. They were the memory of something lost. Those who look for them seek not the light itself, but what it once promised." Radagast leaned on his staff, weary but listening. "Then all we can do is watch. Wait for the next flicker in the dark." Galadriel turned her gaze on him, and for a moment her face seemed lit from within by a light that did not come from the stars. Not wait, prepare. That night Radagast returned to his chamber and wrote a letter, a scroll sealed with a leaf and bound in moss thread. He sent it westward with a sparrow, the smallest of messengers, but fast and sure. Its destination was Roscoe, and it would wait there for his return. Then he sat for a long time, staring at the flame of a single candle, and said nothing. Elsewhere in the forest, Lindariel met with Celeborn in a quiet clearing where the ground was soft and covered in violets. He handed her a sword wrapped in cloth and spoke gently. "The blade you carried is finished. This one is better." When she unwrapped it, the steel shimmered faintly, and along the hilt were woven runes of protection, subtle but strong. She turned it in her hands and nodded. "You'll be leaving soon," he said, not as a question but as a truth. "I don't know where I'll go," she admitted, "but I can't stay. I feel as though there's something more out there waiting. Something we haven't seen yet," Celeborn smiled faintly. "That is the way of those who walk the edge of shadow. You carry part of it with you now." She left the next morning, though not alone. Radagast met her at the border, where Meneldor waited once again. They had said their farewells to Galadriel and Celeborn, shared one last meal among the golden trees, and now stood beneath a sky slowly shifting towards spring. The eagle nodded as they approached, his feathers catching the first light of dawn. "Where to this time?" Lindariel asked, adjusting her pack. Radagast looked east toward the mountains, then farther still toward lands where the maps grew thin. "We follow the river, the one that runs toward Rune. There are whispers of movement there, things stirring that should not be awake." "And if we find another shard?" she asked, her voice calm. "Then we bury it again," he said, climbing onto Meneldor's back. "And if we can't, we break it." Lindariel climbed up behind him, and the eagle took flight, wings wide against the morning sky. Below them, Lothlórien glittered like a dream fading in the light, its trees tall and golden, its paths winding in secret. Ahead lay wild lands and open sky, places untouched by peace and unvisited by hope. But they did not turn back. As they flew eastward past the silver curve of the Anduin and the dark shapes of distant hills, the wind carried the faintest trace of song, a note remembered by the stones and the roots, a song not yet finished, and far below, in the deep places of the world, other songs stirred in answer, waiting to be heard. The lands east of the Anduin were not often marked on maps, and those who had lived there once had either fled long ago or vanished into legend. The hills rolled like waves toward the sunrise, rising into craggy cliffs and dropping into sudden ravines where trees grew twisted and silent. The air tasted of iron and ash, and there was a stillness that clung to the earth as if the land itself was holding its breath. Radagast and Lindariel flew low now, Meneldor gliding along the wind with wings stretched wide, following the curves of a river that shone silver by day and black by night. On the third morning, the eagle veered suddenly, wings tensing against the wind. Below, among the ruins of an ancient watchtower, stood a lone figure wrapped in black, unmoving. From this distance, it could have been a statue. Radagast felt a chill creep up his spine as they passed overhead. He caught only a glimpse. Pale hands clasped before it, a hood drawn low. But the feeling was unmistakable. Something in that figure recognized them. It turned its head slowly as they flew beyond sight. They landed a few leagues later beside a ridge where the river forked and made camp beneath the shelter of overhanging stone. The sun was low, the wind sharp, and the fire they built crackled with more effort than heat. Radagast prepared a broth of roots and bitter leaf, not for taste but for strength, and Lindariel sat sharpening her blade, the new sword from Celeborn glinting dully in the fading light. "Do you think it followed us?" she asked without looking up. "Not yet," Radagast said, stirring the pot. "But it will. These lands were once touched by dark things. The shard may be gone, but its memory is still echoing through the roots of the world." That night, Radagast dreamed again. He stood on the edge of a great lake, still as glass, and beneath its surface lay the drowned towers of a city. Arches, domes, and stone halls, all swallowed by time. In the center of the deepest hall sat a throne of black marble, empty. But the longer he looked, the more he saw a figure taking shape upon it. Not a man, not a beast, a presence. It raised its hand, and the water shuddered. He woke with a start, the fire reduced to embers, and Lindariel sitting upright, sword in hand. She thought she heard it too, she whispered. "There's something nearby." They left at first light, Meneldor rising once more into the air, circling east along the river, until the land below turned to marsh and ruin. The trees grew fewer, and the earth became soft and treacherous. Here the scars of old wars had never healed. Ancient battlefields lay half-buried beneath moss, and crumbled towers jutted like broken teeth from the swampland. Radagast leaned forward, scanning the ground with narrowed eyes. "There," he said, pointing to a cluster of stones shaped into a ring half-submerged in the muck. Meneldor landed carefully, and the companions dismounted. The ring of stones was old, older even than the ruins of Kaldor, worn smooth by water and wind. But in the center, beneath a thin layer of algae, they found a stone basin, empty, save for a spiral carved deep into its center. Radagast brushed it clean with his sleeve, and for a moment said nothing. "It's a well," he said at last, "a listening well, the kind used in the elder days by those who sought to speak with the things beneath the world." Lindariel frowned. "To speak with what? Not with voices," he answered, kneeling beside it. "With memory, with will." As he laid his hand upon the spiral, the stone grew warm beneath his fingers, and the water inside began to rise. Not from rain or spring, but from somewhere far below. It shimmered with strange light, and reflections began to swirl across its surface. He saw glimpses again, the shard, whole and unbroken, shining in the crown of Morgoth, the Silmarils above the trees, the hand that shattered them. And then, clearer than all, he saw a cavern like the one they had left behind, but deeper, colder, and not empty. A voice spoke, not aloud, but in his mind. "The light cannot die. It only waits." He withdrew his hand quickly, staggering backward, but the basin continued to glow. Lindariel moved to his side, her expression hardening. "This isn't finished, is it?" Radagast shook his head. "No, the shard we destroyed was only one piece. But there are more fragments scattered across Middle-earth. Maybe buried, maybe sleeping, but still listening." They spent another night by the listening well, neither sleeping long nor soundly. When the morning came, the marsh was blanketed in mist, and even miners seemed uneasy. Before they left, Radagast placed a runstone upon the basin, a seal of warding drawn from the speech of the trees. It would not stop those who already knew the well, but it would hide it from the unwary. As they took to the sky once more, the mist swirled beneath them, and the basin vanished from view. Their journey turned northward then, toward the wildlands beyond Mirkwood, where the hills rose sharp and forested, and old watchfires once burned along the ridges. Radagast had heard whispers of movement there, shadows gathering near the borders of the east, strange lights seen from afar. Not all the relics of the world had fallen in the west. For a time they said little. The air grew colder, the sky darker, and the clouds thicker with each league. Yet neither of them turned back. They were no longer simply searching for danger, nor running from it. They were hunting it. The memory of the shard had changed them both. Radagast more solemn, more resolved. Lindariel more alert, sharper, her instincts honed like the edge of her blade. One evening, as they camped beneath the shelter of a granite overhang, Lindariel finally spoke what they had both been thinking. "Do you think we'll find them all?" Radagast looked up from his small fire and stirred the pot absently. "No, not in one lifetime, not even in many. But if we find enough, if we scatter them, seal them, silence them one by one, then perhaps no single hand will ever hold them all again." Lindariel nodded and stood, walking to the edge of the camp where the trees began. She looked into the dark and didn't blink. "Then we keep going." The stars turned slowly overhead, and in the vastness between them, ancient lights flickered and faded. Somewhere in the far reaches of the world, deeper than roots, colder than stone, older than fire, another shard stirred, but it did not glow. It waited, and far above, two figures flew beneath the clouds. An old wizard, a silent elf, and a great eagle cutting through the wind, carrying no crown, no banner, no name in song, but bearing with them something far more dangerous: the will to stand against the light's ruin, and the knowledge that in Middle-earth, even the smallest piece of the past could shape the future.